So does Sir John, no? Uh, and we talk about the digital age as something that exacerbates the spread of disinformation, particularly because of the rise of portals such as Google and YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, who all give undue prominence to disinformation because of their algorithms, where users are captured instead of gatekeepers, old media gatekeepers, earning that through a process of vetting for trustworthiness and objectivity. The book clarifies that there are novel dimensions in the digital age, and you reduce the influence of institutional gatekeepers this time around because you're now using computational propaganda. We are all familiar with this. This has been the hot story within the field, even within sociology in the past 2-3 years, especially with the rise of Duterte. And Jonathan Ong and Vincent Cabañas did a very interesting study where they were able to map out how this process of disinformation actually works. And they have a very startling finding. It's a very cynical take, actually, because what is taking place in our country, for instance, is a well-organized, well-oiled machinery which has ties with what you call as the advertising agency in the country, who socially engineer public opinion through paid trolls, and the propagation of disinformation or fake news. And they were able to map this out, the political economy behind it, and it's a startling take, about how public opinion can be swayed by very deliberate moves to sway it towards certain ends. In fact, the rise of the Duterte administration can be attributed to the use of this new weapon, which has become, of course, very vital in the political sphere. But while that may be true, I agree here with the observation of Cherian George, Singapore scholar, is now in Hong Kong, when he said that we should remember that all these disinformation and fake news, to the extreme we can call them as hate propagandists, they're not really dependent on digital media or social media, despite the fact that most of the studies concentrate on this. He would continue to say that it's unfortunate, that conferences on the topics concentrate on books, journals related to disinformation on the internet. And I second my voice on that. It doesn't mean, though, however, that Jonathan Ong and Jason Cabañas have concentrated totally on the more cynical aspect of the phenomenon, because even my own colleagues in sociology, such as Nicole Curato, J.L. Cornelio, and then Jonathan Ong and Jason Cabañas, have also trained their sights on the context where disinformation flows, and I'm following their steps towards that direction. Instead of looking at disinformation per se, I'd like to look at why disinformation is bought. Why do people buy into the lie? And my idea is that there's a context where disinformation thrives. Jonathan Ong, and I think even Nicole Curato and J.L. Cornelio, have, for instance, looked at the resentment of populist publics when it came to the fuel behind the narrative of the Duterte administration, which was, of course, coursed through social media prior to the elections and even now during his administration. Jonathan Ong, Nicole Coroto talked about the failure of the oligarchic elite. That's why the Philippines is patient zero when it comes to disinformation, because somehow that narrative was weaponized and became the springboard for certain politicians to craft their identity and their narrative so as to attract those who have been frustrated with decades of the oligarchic elite's rule, and they've played that card to the hilt, even 6 years into the administration right now. There is a narrative, in other words, why disinformation thrives, and I think Jonathan Ong and my colleagues are going in the right direction by looking into the narrative behind disinformation. So I raised a few questions, therefore, going over this literature in January's work, the pamphlet. If disinformation, for instance, has been there in the past, what connects this practice to the present? On the other side of the equation are people. You have here the cynical social engineers who use social media for very cynical political ends too. But on the other hand, are people. We risk portraying them as gullible automatons. So why do they buy that lie? And I think the answer to that question is that maybe disinformation is a symptom of a larger context that we must also investigate sociologically. And this is what I tried to do. Now, in 2017, from 2016 to 2017, the Department of Sociology of MSU-IIT embarked on a research project on the social carrying capacity, the social, political, and economic uses of Lake Lanao. And I worked with Dr. Nympha Bracamonte and studying the social carrying capacity of Lake Lanao. And what we were able to find out was that the economic viability of the lake has diminished for the Maranao people, and this is replaced by a seeming distrust directed against outsiders who are using the lake, such as the National Power Corporation, now the NGCP, who use the resources of the Maranaos, particularly the water from the lake, to generate hydroelectric power. We've seen this, at least in my generation, we've seen this in the different social science textbooks and civic books, as the pride of the Marcos administration, providing 70% of the power for the rest of the Mindanao grid. But the fish catch has been dwindling, coinciding with the operations of the hydroelectric power plant, and this has created great distrust between the Maranao people and the NCP and the NPC, and people feel that the lake has something to do with the fact that they're not able to get fish from the lake nowadays, And what really caught my attention then, and is something I pursued for this project, is the consistent stories about an American doctor in the 1960s, a biologist, who went to the lake and then poisoned the lake in such a way that the endemic fishes, which used to be plentiful, was replaced by an invasive species, And this invasive species is not very good to eat, and they ended up taking over the lake, replacing the fishes of the endemic fish, and this just tells you about the kind of attitudes that people have, There are even anecdotes of a banquero who was found in Manila and who told the story that this doctor was actually poisoning the lake, And there are first-hand accounts of the process that the doctor went through to poison the lake. This is reflective of the kind of perceptions on the ground versus the power plant, For instance, the fluctuating water of the lake has caused problems with the breeding of the fishes. The periodic opening of the lake caused the elevation to fluctuate, and the breeding grounds are disturbed. There's a lot of money earned by the hydroelectric power plant, but only 1% goes to the province. And then some lakeshore communities do not have power. All these feed into that paranoia, that distrust that I was talking about. And at the center of it is that American, representing somebody who is an outsider, poisoning the endemic fish in the area. No? And then I find out, no, after doing a quick Google search and finding out the primary sources of the studies undertaken by scientists, no, biologists on the Lake Lanao, that and even NPC people, NGCP people nowadays know that what the local people were referring to was the work that Dr. David G. Frey undertook from the 1964 to 1968 and published in a paper in 1974 entitled The Limnological Reconnaissance of Lake Lanao. What I actually did was to undertake basically just a survey, but the perception of people of what he did was that it was poisoning the fish of the lake to replace it with invasive species so that the Maranao people will be driven out of the land and they can make use of the resource. And that was actually true because in the period 1974 was the time when the Agus hydroelectric power plants were being constructed. No? And this tells you the kind of narrative that was present during martial law in relation to Maranao's relationship to Lake Lanao. No? And I'm quoting here something that was expressed by a MSc professor, former MSc professor, about the problem with Lake Lanao and how it's related to the diaspora of the Maranao. No? Maranaos have been dispersed all over the country because the indigenous resource of the lake has been stolen from them. So there's a narrative here. No? And I would just like to highlight the idea of the American doctor, the biologist who studied the lake, as an example of how disinformation can be something that people can wield. They can accept a lie or they can invent something that is not true because it makes sense for them to look at the world that way. It gives them the capacity to understand their oppression, that there are external people who have taken away our resources without giving us due recognition, no, giving us a due share of what we deserve, and that's something that I think characterizes the narrative during martial law. What we did was, well, in this instance, you will be able to see here the narrative of martial law in relation to Maranao, where you need to take a second look about how people use and process information, and that the social echo chamber is not something new, no, but something that the subaltern practices to make sense of their oppression too. They can believe a lie if it empowers them and then gives them an explanation of their suffering. People believe and act for meaningful reasons, no, and they are not mere pawns of cynical forces. So from the martial law narrative, we wanted to find out what are the possible narratives in the post-Marawi siege period, and what the method that we did to understand this. And fortunately, we have not been complete in our data gathering activities and processing. So this is the first stage that we've been able to accomplish. We scoured the internet and tried to figure out what are the narratives in the post-Marawi siege, to compare and contrast it with the narratives during the martial law era. And you have here the phenomenon or the unfortunate reality of refugees, no, who are unable to go back to Marawi city after the siege. No, there's a perception of corruption in relation to the Marawi rehabilitation. This is a post by which became viral about how even the scrap from the most affected area had been carted away and made profit from by contractors, no? And then this includes the frustration about what the BARM is able to do about these issues, because the BARM is supposed to be the manifestation of government's recognition of the right of the region for autonomy, through the peace settlement with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And we were able to figure out a lot of narratives too, that present almost the same kind of narratives during the martial law period. So this includes restrictions about the anti-terror law. So if you see these examples, the narrative from the Lake Lanao during the time of martial rule echoes to present times, and it depicts the same kind of relationship between the Maranao and a government that pushes for its agenda, and there's contradiction and friction there. So what are the implications of these insights or advocacy against disinformation? I think it's important that we shift attention from the lie itself to the narrative, because this reveals the context where disinformation thrives. The narrative provides the grooves where disinformation flows and provides context for people to buy in the lie. It implies that our response must not be limited to not just combating the lie, but also addressing the context where disinformation thrives. And finally, this also means that we consider frames outside of liberal democracy. What I mean here is that when you talk about democracy and decay in relation to disinformation, the assumption here is that the democratic institutions were in the first place functioning and strong. But what if you have instances where that is not the case historically, and you're talking about historical, structural marginalization of a minority, such as the indigenous peoples of Mindanao, like the Moros and the Lumad. And maybe from this frame too, it's quite interesting that if we go beyond the liberal democratic frame, maybe when you talk about disinformation, maybe it's really the classic ideological struggle between classes with differing interests. Anyway.